In the 1950s, NATO conducted an aerial survey of eastern Turkey, which included the region known anciently as Urartu, or Ararat. When the aerial photographs were examined, the specialists noticed one very unique formation on a mountainside about 12 miles south of the volcanic Mount Ararat. This strange formation was in the distinct shape of a ship. Its length was estimated at approximately 500 feet, and out of the hundreds of stereo photos taken of this region, this object was unique. Nothing like it was found anywhere else, including on Mount Ararat. When Dr. Arthur Brandenberger, world authority on photogrammetry at Ohio State University, saw the photo, he stated that in his opinion it had to be man-made, and it was a ship. In 1960, an expedition from the United States, including Dr. Brandenberger, went to the site. After blowing several holes in the formation with dynamite, they came away with the official conclusion that there was nothing of any archaeological interest there. However, Dr. Brandenberger continued to state that he still believed the object needed further examination. In September of 1960, an article appeared in Life magazine telling about the expedition. 27-year-old Ron Wyatt read that article like thousands of others. But unlike others, Ron promised himself that one day he would see the strange object for himself. Ron, the father of 2 and soon to be 3, knew it would be many years before he could ever go to Turkey. But throughout the following years he never gave up his desire to visit the strange boat-shaped object. Ron was an avid student of ancient history, archaeology, and all of the sciences, and had never considered that the Ark could have survived until the present. But in 1960, he saw in Life magazine an object that he believed was the only likely candidate for that distinction. He had read all the eyewitness accounts of Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat, and he had discovered that they were all contradictory. All were in different locations, and all were of varying sizes and shapes. He studied the history of Mount Ararat, and was convinced that nothing made of wood could have survived its past eruptions or glacial flows.
There were many stories about what people claimed to have seen by way of remains of Noah's Ark. These ranged from a boat that had been broken in half and part up on the mountain, part down at the base of the mountain, but most of them implied that the boat had been caught in the ice and preserved and was nearly intact. I didn't feel that that was a likelihood, and as there was no photographs or no real indication that these people had seen anything, I believed that all that would be left was approximately what appeared in the picture in Life magazine in 1960.
The boat-shaped object had many things in its favor. First of all, it was in the mountains, plural, of Ararat, as stated in the biblical account. Second, it was shaped like a sea-going vessel. Studying ship construction, Ron had learned that a barge-shaped vessel simply cannot survive on open, stormy seas. And third, it was approximately 500 feet long, not the commonly accepted 450 feet. Ron had concluded that the author of the Genesis account of the flood, Moses, would not have stated the ark's length in Hebrew cubits. Moses was born and educated in Egypt. The Hebrew cubit came into use many years after Moses' death. The only cubit he would have known would have been the Royal Egyptian cubit of 20.6 inches. This would have meant that the ark was 515 feet long, not 450. In 1975, Ron read the book The Ark File by Rennie Norbergen, a member of the 1960 expedition. For the first time, he now knew the names of the expedition members, and he contacted all but one of them to get directions to the strange object. However, the team had left from the small town of Dobizet on horseback, led by the military, and they could offer him no directions. In 1977, he and his two teenage sons, Danny and Ronnie, flew to Turkey. It took several days of very uncomfortable travel to reach Wyatt. Ron had no idea where to begin looking for the boat-shaped object. After all, it had now been 17 years since the 1960 expedition. Would anyone even remember it? And even if they did, Ron didn't speak the language and had no way to ask. So they checked into the Erzurum Hotel and got some sleep. The next day, they hired a taxi to take them to the road they had entered town on and simply began to walk. Soon they came upon a group of local villagers who looked quite intimidating. But convinced that Ron and the boys were tourists, one of the villagers appointed himself their guide. Ron saw a very large rock which had crosses carved on it. About 10 feet in height, this stone had a hole on one end. Ron remembered seeing similar objects in an archaeology book that were anchor stones used on ancient ships in the Mediterranean Sea. But this one was many, many times larger. When their guide saw Ron's excitement at seeing this, he showed them several other similar stones in and around his village. Most of them had 8 crosses carved on them in the Byzantine and Crusader styles. For the first time, Ron realized the possibility that the Ark had used such anchors, not for anchoring the ship, but for stabilizing it and holding the nose into the oncoming waves. The crosses on these stones were of the style of ancient Christian Byzantines and Crusaders, who were well known for carving crosses on objects they associated with biblical events and places. Did these early Christians connect these stones with the 8 survivors of the flood? The next day Ron and the boys again began to walk the region. This time they came upon an ancient stone house, partially collapsed. Its great age could be seen by the fact that the ground level around it had been raised several feet by eroding soil from the surrounding hills. Extending out in all directions around the house was a system of stone fences, also almost buried with only their tops extending above the ground. But most interesting were the 2 stones sitting beside the house, one standing and one lying flat. These also had 8 crosses carved on their faces, but the crosses were carved on top of some earlier pictographs. There was what appeared to be an arch across the top, which Ron believes was a rainbow. Below this were 8 figures walking away from an ocean wave shape, above which sat a boat shape. On the stone lying on the ground, the second figure from the right was a woman. Her head was bowed and her eyes were closed. On the standing stone, both the first figure, which was a man, and the second figure, a woman, both had their eyes closed and their heads bowed. Ron drew an incredible conclusion. He believed these were possibly the tombstones marking Noah and his wife's graves. The wife, he concluded, had died first, and that is why only she was represented with her eyes closed on her stone. When Noah died, his eyes were shown as closed as well as were his wife's. Nearby was a natural amphitheater between 2 hills with a large stone that appeared to be an altar. Could this possibly be Noah's post-flood home with corrals for breeding various animals and an altar directly behind his house? These were exciting discoveries, but they still hadn't found the boat-shaped object. Finally, the last afternoon they were there, Ron left the boys reading while he made one last search. This time he had the taxi drive in a different direction, south of where they had earlier been. When the taxi had gone as far as it could, he began to walk through the mountains. After a while he saw the boat-shaped formation directly below him. And seeing it this close, he was convinced more than ever that it needed thorough scientific investigation. He needed to learn what lay beneath the surface of the soil covering the strange object. That evening he and the boys paid their hotel bill and arranged for a taxi to take them back to Erzurum in the morning. While packing, they heard the clamor of men coming up the steps, banging on the walls and shouting. When Ron looked down the stairs and saw them, he recognized some as men they had encountered over the last 3 days, and he realized they planned to rob them. The region is so isolated that he knew they were in trouble if they didn't escape quickly. Barricading the door and tying sheets together, they climbed out their window onto a roof where they re-entered the hotel through its kitchen and escaped. But in the commotion, they lost most of their film and luggage.
The results of that trip was that I was pretty well convinced that this boat-shaped formation was the remains of Noah's Ark, and that there were several other archaeological remains out there that showed this to be the area where the Ark had come to rest. And so I was quite happy with that result, and planned to go back at a later date and do more work on the formation itself. When we returned to America, I became aware that there was one other individual that had not agreed with the findings of the Vanderman group. Their findings, of course, or conclusion was that this was just an odd-shaped geological formation. It turns out that Dr. Bill Shea, that worked with a university in Michigan, had come to believe that this boat-shaped formation at the least represented the place where the boat had landed and perhaps had decayed away, but left its imprint in the mountainside out there.
Dr. Shea, too, believed that the site needed to be thoroughly investigated, and when comparing the boat-shaped object to the current thought that the Ark had to have landed on Mount Ararat, he wrote, "To conclude, one might put these two sites in perspective by reflecting upon what would have happened had this formation been found on Arida, or Mount Ararat. I may be wrong, but I suspect that news of it probably would have been heralded far and wide as the discovery of the site where the Ark had rested. What a difference a mountain makes!" Dr. Shea had also written that he too believed that it was likely that the Royal Egyptian cubit was used in giving the measurements of the Ark. Assuming a Mosaic authorship for these measurements probably would indicate that they were given in terms of the Egyptian cubit of 20.6 inches rather than the shorter Mesopotamian cubit. After Ron and Dr. Shea communicated and Ron shared his information from the August 1977 trip with him, Dr. Shea applied to Turkey for permission to excavate. The reply was negative. As far as Ron was concerned, there was nothing else he could do at that point, so he waited for Providence to hopefully provide opportunity. Believing it was important to have some idea of where the Ark would have landed, in 1975 Ron had performed an experiment.